Many people have asked me, why is it that retail gas competition is so widespread, relatively widespread, like 32 jurisdictions and states versus 14 for electricity? And the reason is virtually none of the gas utilities have owned the means of production of natural gas. So they don't oppose restructuring natural gas markets because they weren't getting a guaranteed rate of return on the natural gas anyway. But in electricity, it's different. And unfortunately, utilities in both competitive and non-competitive states are doing everything they can to rewind the clock and to undermine the competitive market fundamentals and to try to dislodge choice. It's going on everywhere. Okay, unless you're asleep, you can see it literally in the trade. You can read it in the papers. You know, what happens in ERCOT in February of 2021. Oh, that's the competitive energy problem. It's because you have choice in Texas. That's why the grid went down. You know, so it's just we really feel that there's a tremendous number of false assumptions and scare tactics going on, and in response to this, RESA, which is the Retail Energy Suppliers Association, which Richard is going to represent in a few seconds, developed a comprehensive list of myths and facts to respond to these false assertions, and you're going to hear a lot about this shortly. It's going to be on our website. Okay, our keynote speaker is a major energy executive in the largest energy company in the country, Constellation, and is here today representing RESA, the Retail Energy Supplier Association. With a career spanning 30 years in the retail energy industry, our keynote speaker helps customers, legislators, and regulatory bodies navigate the densely complex regulatory landscape of retail and wholesale power markets across the country. His solutions-oriented drive and an inherent understanding of how policy impacts energy markets have made him a trusted advocate for retail customers and a trusted source for policymakers as well. Without any further ado, I give you someone who I am proud to call my friend, Richard Spilky.
As soon as you are ready.
I need the slide advancer, please.
It's on there.
It is on there.
See it?
I do not. Is it this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Green is forward.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction. Thanks for the music. That was kind of fun. I'm a child of the 80s, I guess, so I get into the REO Speedwagon. Young people may not know who that is, but you'll get over it. So 25 years ago, the leaders of our industry at that time brought forward and introduced competitive markets as a solution to the problems that they were facing with the utilities inefficiencies, the utility cost overruns. There were huge price disparities going on between different states, right next to each other. I remember growing up, learning to drive again in the 80s. I'm from Illinois. And there were signs, big giant billboard signs on the highways in Illinois from Wisconsin. They were advertisements for Wisconsin, encouraging businesses in Illinois to leave Illinois and go to Wisconsin because Illinois' prices were like quadruple the Wisconsin prices for electricity at that time in the early 80s. So I do remember that even as a teenager learning to drive. I didn't know what was going on. It was like an economic development activity for Wisconsin to try to lure businesses out of Illinois. So I do remember that. And so this was definitely what was happening and why people thought that, restructuring and competitive markets was going to be a solution to some of that. Now there were some growing pains. I think those of you who are my age will remember, the California crisis. They unrolled a pretty bad model that caused a lot of problems and outages. It was not, I believe the other states didn't use a model like California's and didn't have those experiences. There was also the Enron situation, which certainly didn't help. They exacerbated the problem in California. They did a lot of dishonest things that gave our industry a black eye that we're still living with the aftermath today. And since that time, the opponents have been relentless, like Jack was saying. They've been just relentless, both in the states that already have choice and in the monopoly states that want to make sure that that doesn't happen to their state, have been relentless in their criticism of competitive markets. And, the frustrating part for me is the truth is, despite the initial growing pains that I mentioned, the competitive markets are doing great. They're knocking it out of the park, and I'm going to show you some facts and figures here in a minute to prove that to you. So the truth is that a lot of the criticism is unjustified. Jack mentioned, they're using scare tactics and drawing, inaccurate conclusions, based on assumptions that are just not true. And so to try to address that, we wrote a paper at RESA, Retail Energy Supplier Association. It just got put on the website. I understand it's also available on the EMC website, and it's called The Myths and Facts of Retail Power. And I'm going to give you just a sampling of that in just a minute. Now, one of the early industry leaders that I referred to, he was a mentor of mine. We've since lost him. He passed away in 2018. His name was Phil O'Connor. You see his picture up there. And Phil was a great guy. He taught me so much, and he published. Not only he was the guy who got a lot of customer choice going across the country, in particular in Illinois, but he followed up with it and tried to defend it and tried to advocate for its growth. And he himself became frustrated, as I think we are too today, because all these false assumptions. So there's this quote that I have here from him. And he says, if we're going to keep debating whether competitive electricity markets are beneficial, let's at least limit the debate from our experience and not from unsupported conjectures. That's a direct quote from one of his white papers. And he wrote a white paper a few years ago, before he passed away, that was entitled Conjectures and Refutations. That's what the title of it was. And so I was looking at that the other day, even though it's like 5-7 years old, and it kind of inspired me to write a new paper. And of course, they wouldn't let me call it Conjectures and Refutations because that's too complicated. So we called it Myths and Facts. And we updated the material, and so it was inspired by his white paper from before. I want to also point out that this is an excerpt from the RESA website. So RESA has continued to honor Phil and to put forward his thought leadership by updating his white papers and his material. There's just a ton of resources available on the RESA website, on the Phil O'Connor Thought Leadership page. And this paper itself is now published and available for you to download anytime you want from the RESA website and also from the EMC website, I understand. So thank you, Jack, for doing that. So let's get into it. Let's talk about it. There's 16 myths. Phil's original paper of Conjectures and Refutations, as he called it, had 4. So we've added to the list. So I'm just going to rip through the 16 real fast, but I'm going to then back up and spend more time, to give you a sample, sample explanation of a few of them so you get an idea of where we're going. So first of all, I call these the general myths. The first one, Jack already illustrated for me. Thank you, Jack. We didn't plan it that way. But this term deregulated, so that's one of the ones I'll dive into. And then, who can choose and who can't choose is often an area of confusion of what's a competitive state and what isn't, and what's wholesale competition, what's retail competition, what's the difference. Anyway, so we'll talk about that. The Winter Storm Uri event, Jack mentioned that. These are fresh. These are ones that Phil could not have written about because they happened, fairly recently. But I myself have seen 2 formal communications from executives at monopoly utility companies, basically saying, "Aren't you glad we don't have competition and choice in our area? Because look what happens when you allow competition and choice, in the aftermath of the winter event." So we talk about those, both from a price perspective and from a reliability perspective. There's tons and tons. I'm not going to get into all these now, but I'll show you 1 or 2 examples. There's just tons of price evidence and price misunderstanding of which prices are which and which markets are doing better, and is it better to have choice or is it better to have a monopoly, and who's got the higher prices, and it's just and people just make all these grand illusions and grand assertions that are just not true. So I'm going to grab a couple of these and show you some examples of what I mean. Reliability. In addition to the specific reliability issues that Texas experienced in February, just in general, when it comes to building generation for adequate resource adequacy or capacity, when it comes to allowing retail choice, the opponents of customer choice in markets are very quick to say, well, if you allow choice in this state, you can kiss your reliability goodbye. It's just going to go down the tubes. Or boy, we sure wish we didn't have customer choice because our reliability has just gone south. Well, none of that is true if you look at the data, and I'll show that to you. And so we created these myths and facts to explain these things. Risk assignment. Here's another one that's commonly misunderstood. Who takes on the risk? When you allow choice and allow competition, when you take the generation assets out of the rate base, like Jack was talking about a moment ago, and you allow the competitive market to invest in the generation market rather than a guaranteed rate of return with the utility, is that more risk or less risk for the customers? Where does the risk go? And oftentimes people say, well, of course the risk is on the customers. Well, in a monopoly market, that is true. It is the customers taking the risk because they're being provided a guaranteed rate of return on the backs of the ratepayers. But in reality, it's the competitive market that takes the risk away from the customers themselves. But people sometimes understand it to be the opposite of that. So we have evidence on that too. A couple other myths here regarding, are customers even interested in choice? We have this, utility rate book full of tariffs and full of options. We don't need retail suppliers. We don't need competition. We're doing just great. I myself, I told you I'm from Illinois. The city of Chicago entered into a municipal aggregation agreement a few years back, and we switched like 800,000 residential accounts to that muni ag program for several years, and then they went back to default service after that period because at that time the retail supplier could no longer compete with the default service. Some people call that a failure of the competitive market. I call it a success. The customers or the city council on their behalf made the best economic choice in both cases and made that switch. Plus, the whole system worked. Switching 800,000 residential accounts all in one short period of time back and forth, on two different occasions is quite an achievement actually. And the system worked. There were of course a few bugs, it wasn't perfect, but for the most part it worked and it was largely successful. So I call that a success of the competitive market and not a failure. So let's get into some of these. And Jack, thank you for teeing up the first one. States and jurisdictions that have retail choice are deregulated. I hate that word. Now I know that we're swimming upstream here, and I know I'm asking you guys a lot. I guess I'm asking Jack too much too, apparently. But I'm going to ask you not to use the word deregulated. Why? Why am I encouraging you not to use that word? There's two reasons why I don't want you to use that word. First of all, and most important, I suppose, it isn't true. You're telling me that in this state, New York, or Pennsylvania, or the New England states where we have retail choice, that we are not regulated. There are no rules. And if you don't believe me, I've got an army, or at least a small brigade of compliance attorneys at my company that will argue differently. I mean, the regulations are intense and they are thick. So deregulated is not an accurate term. We are not deregulated. That is not what our industry is. It's restructured. It allows for choice. It allows for competition. But deregulated is what it's not. And I know that people use that word all the time, the deregulated markets. I know. Don't use that word. Help me encourage people not to use that word. It's not true. Secondly, the second reason why we shouldn't use that word is because our opponents like to use that word. Our opponents that don't appreciate the benefits of competitive markets or don't like them use the word deregulated to infer it's a free-for-all, it's the gunfight at the OK Corral, it's like taking your hands off the steering wheel, anything can happen. They use that word as a criticism of the competitive markets. And of course, that's not how they work. There aren't people in, the competitive states, going without electricity and, worrying about if they're going to have electricity tomorrow. That's not the way it is. It's not a free-for-all. It works. So it's just governed by market forces rather than by guaranteed rate of return. So I ask you and I urge you to consider not using that word, and that goes for Jack too. All right, number two, I'm not going to go through all 16 of them, trust me, it just happens, I'm picking 1 and 2. Who can choose and who can't? And this is kind of important to the research here, so I do want to spend time on this one. So who can choose and who can't? So I made this little chart to explain what we mean when we talk about who can choose and who can't, and who's restructured and who isn't. So the green colored states, Jack referred to this in his remarks, he said the 14. So there's 14, there's actually 13 states in Washington, D.C. So I might call those 14 states, I might call them 14 jurisdictions, because D.C., of course, is not a state technically, if you want to be technical. But anyway, the 14 green colored states, I'll call them, are the states that have fully restructured. And what do I mean? I mean that all customers can choose a retail supplier, residential, commercial, industrial. They don't have to pay stranded costs anymore. And most importantly, those utilities in those states that are colored green do not own the generation resources anymore. The generation resources are not in the rate base of those utilities. They've divested the generation assets some time ago. The states in the dark colored gray are what I call the hybrid states. So those states are still, traditional vertically integrated monopolies, but they allow some kind of choice and some kind of fashion for a small segment of customers, and the rules are very different in those dark gray colored states. They're still pretty much monopolies, but they have some tiny little ability for some customers to choose. And then the light gray colored states are just the pure monopoly states that are still, without choice whatsoever. So when we do the data, when we do the analysis, when I show you charts coming up here, and this was Phil O'Connor's idea, and we've continued to move it forward, we basically just add up all the data in the green colored states, the competitive states, and then we add up the data in the other 35 states that I'll call the monopoly states, and we compare things side by side. How have things performed? How have things gone? Pricing, generation efficiencies, generation build, rate of return, you name it. We measure everything, reliability. So we compare those two groups as if they were one place, side by side, over time. All right, so skipping on to myth number 6. This is an important one, if you read it here, about the pricing. So, this is audience quiz question time. Participation time, how exciting. So, I'm going to show you one bar. Here's your only hint. Right now I can't read this, you're going to have to help me. What does it say, Jack?
1089.
1089, okay. That green bar is true. That is the weighted average price of all the green colored states, the competitive states that I showed you a second ago, all 14 of them. That's residential, commercial, industrial, everything mixed together. That is the weighted average price, including delivery services, the whole thing, the whole electric bill, the whole thing. Broker margins in there, retail supplier margin, default service, everything's in there, 10.89. So the accusation is, the monopoly folks, the pro-monopoly folks will say, well, the prices in the competitive states are higher than they are in the monopoly states, so why do we want to restructure here? You guys have higher prices. Why would we want to do something to create higher prices? Okay, so guess. I want someone to guess. Not Jack. Someone, not Jack. What do you think? Well, you don't have to give me a number, but do you think the monopoly states are higher or lower?
Higher.
Okay, I've heard a lot of higher. Anybody say lower? It actually is a tiny bit lower. It's true, the monopoly states are lower by about 0.5 cent or less. So the accusation is half true. The competitive states, now when you think about that, when I showed you that map a minute ago, what were the competitive states? New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Illinois, Texas, some of the more densely populated urban places that are high cost of living places. We must remember the restructured states are restructured because they were high cost to begin with. That's why they restructured. They already had high costs. What are the monopoly states? Nebraska, Iowa, Indiana, less populated, less urban places. So it's not surprising that the monopoly states cost less than the competitive states. So that part of the accusation is true. It is a little bit higher in the competitive states. Guilty as charged. We're guilty. That's a true fact. But should that be the question? In my mind, the question should be, how have those states performed since they changed the form of regulation? They all were monopoly states at one point in time. So after stranded costs have come off, after divestiture has occurred, after customers have started shopping, And then we got shale gas, we got renewables, we got hurricanes, we got this, we got that, the polar vortex. How have the markets performed in the competitive states compared to the monopoly models side by side over time? Well, let's look. The competitive states in 2008 were 11.75. So they've actually come down. This is not inflation adjusted. These are real numbers, nominal numbers, we call them. They've actually dropped in the competitive states over this 12, 13-year period of time. The monopoly states, meanwhile, have risen significantly. So, in my mind, the question should not be, gee, are the prices higher? I mean, if you want to buy a bottle of beer in the bar downstairs here in New York City, or I want to buy a bottle of beer in Lincoln, Nebraska, which one do you think is going to cost more? I mean, of course, it's going to be higher in the higher cost of living place. So, it shouldn't be the question of relative pricing. In my opinion, it should be the performance under a different form of regulation. And if you look at the percentages, the competitive states have dropped by 7.4%. The monopoly states have gone up 21%. So that's the truth. If you extrapolate that, this is the same kind of information in a different way. The black line is all the monopoly states together since 08, the percentage price change. The green line is the competitive states price change since 08. And if you extrapolate that across the country, the competitive states, and I can't read the number, Jack, but in the green box, it's 300 and some billion.
343.
343, thank you. So the competitive states, if they would have followed the same trajectory as the monopoly states, they would have paid $343 billion more. So in other words, you could say that because they weren't monopoly states and they didn't act like monopoly states, the competitive folks saved $343 billion, and that includes New York in that number. And then on the flip side of that coin, the monopoly states, if they would have acted like the competitive states did, they would have saved, what is it, 500 billion, 400 billion? 500 billion dollars, had they had the same price performance that the competitive states did. That's savings they did not see because they didn't restructure. Moving on to the next myth. Yeah, I love this one. How many have you heard it said? I mean, I hear it all the time because I'm in the monopoly states trying to make something happen, and it's hard work. But I hear all the time, well, if we lower the prices for the industrial big guys, the residential customers are going to be harmed. Well, that's true if you're in a monopoly model. If you're in a monopoly state and you have a revenue requirement, you've got to get a guaranteed rate of return. In order to get that guaranteed rate of return, you have to have a certain amount of revenue. If you lower this guy's bill by $1, you have to raise that guy's bill by $1 to make up for it. So if you're in a monopoly mentality and you're a regulator and that's all you know, then that makes sense to you. If I lower business customers by $1, I got to raise the residential by $1 because I got to keep the revenue requirement the same. It's true. In a monopoly model, that's how it works. But we're not talking about a monopoly model. We're talking about competition. So again, let's look at the truth. If we look at the competitive states on the left, again, since 08, and this is similar information to what you saw before, but now it's broken out by rate class. So let's look at the residential customers in red. Over that period of time, in the competitive states, including New York, the prices have risen, is it 4-point-something%? I can't read it, 4.7%. And in the monopoly states, they've gone up 25%, I think it says, 25%. So the residential customers are benefiting tremendously by allowing competitive markets. Yes, their prices have gone up 4% in the past 12 years, but they've gone up 25% in the monopoly states. Which one's treating residential customers better? The competitive market or the monopoly states? Now, if you look at the C&I customers in green and purple, I'm not going to read the numbers to you, but you can just glance at it and see the business customers are knocking it out of the park. The business customers should be throwing our industry a parade. I don't think they are, but I think that we're justified in throwing a parade, but I haven't heard of one being planned. But the bottom line is the business customers are saving a heck of a lot more by being exposed to competitive markets than they are in the monopoly states. The residential customers are benefiting too. Everybody wins in a competitive market is what I'm trying to say, not just the business customers. Moving on to the next one. Yeah, this is another one that you hear all the time. Well, we got a big rate book with lots of choices. Okay, so the truth is, what's the truth? This chart is showing the proportion of load that has switched over time in the competitive states relative to the default service tariffs from the utility. And the blue line on top is showing, I think it's 82%, is that what it says, Jack? 82? 87, pardon me. 87% of the kilowatt hours, the megawatt hours of the business customers, C&I, is with a retail supplier and not on the utility tariff. Now, on the residential side, you can see in orange, it's a little less than 50%. I think it's 47-ish. So we do have some work to do on residential, but even there, it's approaching 50%. And then the green line is just, everything altogether. It's 70-something percent, I think, 72% for overall. But what I say to my colleagues at Constellation, especially the sales guys, when I want them to get off their desk and get out and go get some business, I say, of course, this is when we had offices, if you remember what offices look like. And I would point out the window in Chicago, and it's just like New York. It's not as big as New York, but almost. We have big buildings and hotels and business offices. And I'd say, look at all these buildings. 87% of them are with a retail supplier. And you ain't it. So go get them. I don't know if they appreciate me saying that to them, but I would show them the statistic and say they're with somebody, and if it's not with you, only 13% of them are with the utility, so the majority of them are interested. So the point is, though, in addition to my trying to encourage the salespeople, the point is, when customers have a choice, they're choosing, especially the business customers. So the utility line that, we got all these tariffs, and our tariffs are great, we don't need choice, doesn't hold water. So, I guess in conclusion then, back to Phil. I think the time has come now where we're now the leaders of the industry. A lot of the folks that got retail choice established 25 years ago with legislation and regulations are either retired or no longer with us, like Phil, and we're the leaders now. It comes down to us. And these are some of the tools that we can use, these facts, these figures, these results. We can be proud of the achievements that we have in our industry. We don't need to be embarrassed. There are some problems that still need to be fixed. That's true. We still have some issues that need to be addressed. It's not perfect. But generally speaking, it's working really well. And it's our job. It comes to us. If we don't defend it, if we don't educate, if we don't fix the things that need to be fixed, we're not going to be able to expand it to the next level, and we may not even be able to defend effectively the markets that we already do have that are starting to retract in some ways. So I want to thank Jack and EMC for letting me share this message with you today. I want to thank you all for listening, and I want to encourage you all to join RESA in our efforts to expand and defend the competitive retail energy space. Thank you.